I was entirely planning on doing weekly reading vlogs during the Owls read-a-thon, but I'm just clearly not very good at remembering to vlog because I checked in, well, I skipped the first day because I forgot, and then I vlogged the second day and then didn't vlog any other day that week. So clearly that's not working for me. And also, I realised that lots and lots of people are doing reading vlogs during the Owls read-a-thon, and so I thought, since it doesn't work for me anyway and it's a struggle, maybe I should try something a little bit different. So I thought about what kind of videos I like to watch and what kinds of videos I like to film, and so I decided that instead of doing 4 weekly reading vlogs, I would do 4 wrap-up videos every time I achieve reading 3 books. So I finished my 3rd book this morning. It is currently the 13th of April, so a very slow start to the reading month for me, but you will see why in just a moment. But I'm going to kick us off with the first book that I finished as part of the Owls read-a-thon, which was In Real Life by Cory, Doctorow and Jen Wang, and this is a graphic novel, and my first graphic novel. Although I've read some manga before, I haven't read any graphic novels before, so this was a little bit different for me, but it was something that I really enjoyed. This graphic novel follows a character named Anda who enjoys playing video games, and in her first foray into online video games, she joins an MMO, or a massively multiplayer online game. And when she gets into this game, she joins a group of people who are hunting down accounts, who are collecting gold, it's called gold mining, to sell to people in the real world for real world money. And like I said, Anda gets involved in shutting these gold miners down, but she starts to discover that there is more to this than she first realised. And I'm not going to tell you any more than that because it's a graphic novel, and as you can see it is quite short, so there's not much to it. And I did enjoy it. I particularly enjoyed the art and the format of this read. Like I said, I haven't read any graphic novels before, and this was quite an easy one to get started on. Like I said, it's quite short and it wasn't overly complex. I did enjoy it. I recommended it to my sister Natalie, who you saw in my last video, and my boyfriend Lee, and they both enjoyed it too. Is it amazing, fantastic, groundbreaking? No. Is it enjoyable? Yes, it is. I think that it's quite a nice, almost coming of age type story, because when you're around the age that our protagonist is in this one, you start to realise that the world is bigger than just the little bubble that you live in, especially if you start playing online video games. So I did enjoy that exploration. I particularly enjoyed, there's a foreword in this written by the author Cory Doctorow. Jen Wang was the illustrator, I believe, but Cory Doctorow wrote a foreword which I thought was very insightful, and I think almost more impactful than the actual novel itself. So I really enjoyed that. There was one particular passage that I wanted to read to you that I personally found quite interesting in the foreword. It reads, "It's not surprising that GameSpace has become a workplace for hundreds of thousands of gold farmers who undertake dreary, repetitive labour to produce virtual wealth that's sold to players with more money and less patience than them. The structural differences between in-game play and in-game work are mostly arbitrary, and real work is half a game anyway. Most of the people you see going to work today are LARPing, live action role-playing, an incredibly boring RPG role-playing game called professionalism that requires them to alter their vocabulary, posture, eating habits, facial expressions, every detail, all the way down to what they allow themselves to find funny." And I just found that comparison to the personalities that we create for ourselves online versus the personalities that we create for ourselves in real life really fascinating. And having read that before reading the contents of the primary novel that is in this book just made a big difference for me, and I think that that insight was really interesting, and it opened my eyes to something that I should have probably realised in my life before, which is that we do all put on personas for different aspects of our lives. And does that mean that all of those people are us, or are we hiding our real selves behind this persona that we think that the world wants to see from us? It's just an interesting conversation, and it was really surprising for me to get so much out of what really is just a very short graphic novel, which on the face of it is really just about a video game, but actually not only does our character discover that it's about so much more, but we as a reader discover that it's about so much more as well, which I found highly enjoyable, and I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. Then we come to my second book finished in the Owls read-a-thon, and this is the reason why I haven't read as much yet as I would have liked to, and that is because I decided that it would be a great idea to pick up The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon, which is 804 pages long. Now, where I got the fantastic idea that this would be a good second book to read, in fact I picked this up first in this read-a-thon, I don't know, but I did it because I wanted to read this book, and it is an adult book, so it fit in the charms category of reading an adult book, age line. So yeah, I decided to pick this up because clearly I enjoy punishing myself. But anyway, this is it's marketed as an epic fantasy standalone, which doesn't happen very often, so kudos to Samantha Shannon for taking on that challenge, because I really do think that there needs to be more standalone epic fantasy, because a lot of people don't want to invest the time in a series, especially when you could be waiting years for the next installment. Trust me, we all know that pain, and it's painful. So the fact that this is standalone fantasy is great, but I don't know that I necessarily agree that it's epic fantasy. Definitely not epic fantasy on the same scale as most of the epic fantasy that I read. However, I deeply respect this book because I actually think that it is a fantastic start in epic fantasy if you're not typically an epic fantasy reader. We do have a big world, we do have a reasonably large cast of characters, and there is a magic system, perhaps arguably a couple of magic systems, and there are different theologies going on here, different political opinions, different cultures, so there's a lot going on. And contrasting against that, we have a plot that actually isn't too complicated or in depth, and I think that that was my main issue with this book, was that for me the plot was just a little bit slow, and there were some subplot points which I found a little bit convoluted, and actually to me they kind of felt like they were in there just to get certain characters to where they needed to be for the main plot. But nevertheless, I do think this is a great start in epic fantasy if you're not typically an epic fantasy reader, because although it has all of those big things, big world, big cast, magic system, etc, all of those things are big on an epic scale, but the reason I'm not convinced for me that this is epic fantasy is because all of those things are big, but they aren't complex. So we have a big world, but we don't have a lot of world building. We have a big cast of characters, but we only really follow a few of them. We have a couple of magic systems, but they're soft magic systems without a whole ton of rules that you need to understand and learn to be able to follow what's going on in this book. So that's why I say it's fantastic if you're just getting started in epic fantasy. If you're a seasoned epic fantasy reader, I think you should go into it thinking of it as more high fantasy than epic fantasy. I think I would have enjoyed enjoyed this book more if I had gone into it like that. Having said that, I did enjoy this read and I felt extremely connected to a lot of the characters, and the plot was enjoyable. The main plot line of the book was very enjoyable. Did I think that it was a little bit slow paced for me? Yes, I did. I think I found the majority of the book a little bit slow, and then the end was way too fast, and for me, for a standalone book, there wasn't enough closure with each of the characters. We really only got a couple of pages at the very end of this 800-page book to say goodbye to each of our main characters, and that wasn't enough because it was really the characters that kept me invested in this one. And if I hadn't been invested in the characters, it may well have been a DNF for me, because the plot wasn't enough on its own, in my opinion, to keep me reading this one. I stayed invested because I really enjoyed the characters and I cared deeply about what was going to happen with them. I'm not touching too much upon the plot because, like I say, in my opinion, there wasn't a huge plot line in the book, and so I don't want to give away too much of it because, you know, the plot took a really long time to properly get going. There was a lot of build up right at the beginning, a lot of character introductions, and that again is why I say maybe it's quite good for new epic fantasy readers, because usually I have found in epic fantasy you have all of those introductions happening at the same time that the plot is moving forward, and that can make things really confusing right at the beginning of a book, whereas this one focused on the introductions of the characters, of the worlds, of the situations we were in before we started moving the plot forwards, which made it a little bit more easily digestible, I think. But for me, that made it not quite complex enough, just because of the type of books that I ordinarily read. So it's not really a criticism of this book in particular, it's just that this wasn't quite what I was expecting, because I was expecting my usual epic fantasy and it's not that. For me it was more high fantasy, but like I said before, it's the size of epic fantasy with the complexity of high fantasy, which I think makes it a really great transitional book for people who want to get into epic fantasy. I couldn't recommend this one more. In terms of themes that are in it, because I can't tell you too much about the plot, there are dragons, which I always love. We have both good and bad dragons, which is great. We have magic, as I mentioned. We have a little bit of politics at play, which is always a nice inclusion. We also have a east-west divide going on, and the culture across east and west is very different, which is very reflective of our own world, and I appreciated that. And in fact, the cultures within the story, east-west, pretty much mirrored our own world, slightly more in our past. So in the west, our characters were based in and around a queendom and in a court, so you had lots of court politics, which is a pretty typical theme within any fantasy story. You'll find that the majority of fantasy is typically European based, and I think that we very much saw that in our Western society in this story. But then we also have the addition of the Eastern society, which I think was very much influenced by Chinese culture. I don't know too much about Chinese culture, so I don't want to say that definitively, but I definitely got that vibe while I was reading this one, and I really liked that. I liked the fact that we got both of those things in this one book, and it does somewhat explain why it's so big. So it doesn't need to be this big for the plot, it needs to be this big for the characters and the culture, and it's a very rich book in that regard, but it was just a little bit on the slow side for me. So unfortunately I only gave this one a 3 out of 5 stars, but like I said, I don't think I'm the perfect audience for it, because I think it's very much intended to get people into epic fantasy, and I respect Samantha Shannon so much for that, and I respect this book so much for that, because epic fantasy is my favourite kind of book, and I really want other people to stop being scared of epic fantasy, get into these worlds and enjoy them as much as I do, because once you discover epic fantasy and start loving it, it takes over your life. It's incredible. A friend of mine from work hasn't read epic fantasy before. She's read this book and she absolutely loves it, and I love seeing that. I love seeing a new audience come to this amazing, amazing genre that I love so much. So just for that reason, I really loved this book. And then finally, I read Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard, or I should say I reread Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard. I should mention actually, this was my read for the Arithmancy prompt, which was to read a book by more than one author. So we have Cory Doctorow and Jen Wang. Priory of the Orange Tree, I think I mentioned I read for the Charms OWL. Read an adult book because it's inspired by the age line charm. Red Queen was the book for Defense Against the Dark Arts, inspired by the spell Reducto. Read a book beginning with the letter R. So Red Queen does in fact begin with the letter R. And like I mentioned, this is a reread for me. I read this when it first came out, which was in 2015, I want to say. Yeah, 2015. So I read this for the first time then, and at that point it had just come out, so it was the only book in the series, and I really enjoyed it. I wanted to read the rest of the books in the series, but I wasn't so invested that I was, you know, down for reading them each year. So I've waited until the whole series is out, which it now is, and now I'm coming back to the series. And because I read it, you know, 4 years ago, I wanted to pick this one back up, reread it to refresh the story in my mind before then reading the rest of the series. And so I have, and it just so happened that it fit in with one of these prompts, so happy days. This book follows a girl named Mare, and Mare is a red, and what a red is somebody with red blood who is the common folk, the serfs, if you will, if we're sticking to our fantasy terms, and their world also has silvers. These are people with silver blood, and the people with silver blood have magic and are in power. And Mare gets caught up in the silvers world when she discovers something about herself that she never expected, and the silvers didn't expect it either. So this is a book that is very much centered around the magic, but it's also centered around a character who is trying to find themselves and their feet in a world that is not theirs and that they don't feel comfortable in and that they disagree with every fibre of their being. I remember really enjoying this book the first time that I read it in 2015, but I think that I didn't enjoy it as much this time because this story is very much built on suspense and not knowing what's going to happen next. And so I think the fact that I vaguely remembered the main plot points impacted upon my enjoyment this second read through, because I didn't benefit from that suspense because I knew what was going to happen. I remembered all the main points. The reason I wanted to reread it was to make sure that I hadn't forgotten any of the smaller details, which I had. So I'm glad that I reread it, but I only gave it a 3 stars this time because without that level of suspense, it just wasn't as good of a book. So I've put it on 3 stars on Goodreads, but what I think I'm actually going to do is I'm going to bump it up to 4 stars and just explain in my review that on a first read it was 4 stars, but if you take away that suspense, it brings it down to a 3. But I did still enjoy it, and I'm glad that I have reread it because it has reminded me that I enjoyed it, and it makes me want to carry on with the rest of the series, which I have on my shelf, so that's just as well. Those are the first 3 OWLs I have completed, so I have now passed my Arithmancy, my Charms, and my Defense Against the Dark Arts exams. So that's 3 books out of the 12 that I would ideally like to finish. I'll be happy if I hit 9, I'll be ecstatic if I hit 12. As it happens, as I'm filming this, I have finished one other book, but that will be in my next Owls wrap up. So that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to see more like this from me, then do think about hitting that subscribe button, and I hope to see you here again soon. Thanks, bye.